In this example, we're going to illustrate how to use Windows Azure drives. Now, if you remember, a drive is simply a page blob formatted as a fixed NTFS virtual hard drive between 16 megabyte and 1 terabyte. So in this example, we're simply going to illustrate how to use and build a Windows Azure drive. So to do so, let's fire up Microsoft Visual Studio. So let's fire up a new instance of that, and let's run that as administrator. Because remember, anytime that we are working with a cloud in Visual Studio, we need to develop as an administrator. So we need to run Visual Studio in administrative mode. All right, now with Visual Studio started, let's create a new project. In our other projects, when we were developing for Azure Storage, we created simple Windows Forms projects, but this project is going to be a little different. We're going to create a cloud project, specifically a web role, to illustrate how to work with Azure drives. So we've got our cloud selected and our Windows Azure project template selected, but let's call this Azure Drive Demo and click OK. And the type we want to create is we want to create an ASP.NET web role, and let's change that the web role name to Cloud Drive App and click OK. Now you notice it created our web application, but since we're dealing with drives, Windows Azure Storage drives, you'll notice that it did include, just like all our other Windows Azure projects, it did include the appropriate Windows Azure references, but since we're dealing with drives, it's missing one. So the first thing we need to do is go add a new reference. Then we'll browse to the same location that these other references are located, the actual DLLs are located. So that's in C Program Files, down to the Windows Azure SDK 1.4 in the reference. And you'll notice that there's a Cloud Drive DLL, and that's what we need to reference. So there's our new reference. We're done with that. Now let's go back to our default.espx page and let's design that. What we want to do in this example is we're simply going to add a couple of controls. But first, let's add a new line. And let's drag a button onto that new location. And what we're going to do is in this code, we're going to simply create the drive. So let's double click that to get to the click event of this button. Now before we actually get going, we're going to add a few references. Obviously we need to add references to the Windows Azure namespaces. So let's do that now. But we're also going to add an additional one using system.io, and we'll be using that here shortly. And then our standard Windows Azure references. Let's just copy that, make it faster. So this will be storage client, and this will be .service runtime. All right, now we're ready to go. Okay, typically our previous examples have been using actual Windows Azure storage up in the cloud, but for this example we're going to change that a little bit, and we're actually going to use our local development storage to illustrate how the Windows Azure drives work. But like our other examples, we do need access to our cloud storage account, so we need to do the same thing that we did there. So we'll say cloud storage account. But in this example, we're going to say, you know what, use our development storage. There we go. Now that we want to work with our local environment and for our Windows Azure drive, we now need to use a local resource. We can say local resource, call this local cache, equals role environment dot get local resource. And we're going to call this instance drive cache. Now, the local resource and the role environment represent the Windows Azure environment in which an instance of the role is running. So that's why we need to put this here. Now, before we go any further, we also need to make one change. So let's save everything we have, but we need to go over to our Solution Explorer, and we need to open our server file, because this local resource is actually referencing an instance drive cache resource, but we haven't defined that yet. We need to go to our service definition file, and we actually had to need that local resource and define that here in our service definition file. So let's go here. It could really be anywhere in here. Let's say local resource, local resources. We're going to add that instance drive cache local resource, and it must be defined here in our service definition file. So we're going to say local storage, and the name is our local drive cache. Let's go back there and copy that. And we're going to say clear on roll recycle equals false, meaning we want to persist our storage. We don't want it to clean on the roll recycle. And then we're just simply going to say size in megabytes equals, and we'll just say 300 megabyte. All right, so we're done with that. So now we can keep going here in our code. All right, so now we've defined our local storage. Now let's define and start working with our local drive. So here we can say cloud drive, and we need to initialize the cache. So we're going to say local cache, which is the local cache that we defined here. So it would be local cache and the root path, as well as the local cache and the maximum size in megabytes. So basically we're saying what this does is it initializes the optional read cache for any of the drives that we mount that are associated with that role instance. So anything that we're going to work with, we need to initialize. Okay, so let's keep going, and we need to create a cloud blob client. Again, these are blobs formatted as NTFS, so we need to create an instance of a cloud blob client, and we're going to say create a new cloud blob client, and get a container reference, to one called drives, and then we're going to say if it doesn't exist, create it. So create if not exists. And then our next statement is again the cloud drive. Now we're defining our cloud drive. And so let's create the cloud drive. But here we're going to get a specific instance to the container and the drive. The container and the blob. So a reference to both the container and the blob that we want to work with. So here we say the blob client dot get container reference. Specify the drives dot get blob reference, and we're just going to call this my awesome drive. We need to specify this as a URI, so .URI .toString. There, we're ready to go. Now we haven't really created it yet, because to do that we need to actually do a cd.create. Okay. But what we're going to do is we're going to actually wrap that in a try statement, because we want to know if it actually fails or not. So let's put that in a catch, and because, my mistake, so we actually have to specify up here the size of the NTFS that we want to specify. So we're actually just going to create one about, let's create it 64 meg. So this is going to create a drive that is 64 meg. So let's define our catch, and actually there's a cloud drive exception that we can create. So cloud drive exception, and we're just going to, if there's any errors, we're just going to write that to the console. So write line exception dot message dot toString string. Okay, there we go. Now, so we've created it, but we also need to assign that a drive letter. So here we can say, define our drive letter. Let's call it drive letter. And now we need to mount it. So we've created it, but we haven't assigned it a drive letter. So we're going to assign it a drive letter, and we do that by mounting it. So anytime we do a mount, right, you'll see it says mounts the Windows Azure drive and returns a path to the drive on the local file system. So we need to mount that, and we're going to specify the cache size. We're just going to give that a size of 25, and some options. And the options are what sets the Microsoft options for when we mount the drive, and we're just going to force the mounting of the drive. And we can say, when we're all done, let's unmount that drive. So cd.unmount. Okay. So we're done part one of this. So let's compile this to make sure there are no errors. Okay, we're all good to go. So let's run this. Now before we click the button, let's go back and look at our code and say this really isn't going to do much. It's going to define our local instance, create the drive, mount it, and then unmount it. So it's really not going to do anything. So let's just step through it so that we can see what it's actually doing. So let's go back here and click our button. So we're defining our storage, initializing the cache, creating a reference to the container, creating the actual cloud drive. Great, it's created. We're going to assign it, and our drive letter is actually B, and then let's unmount that. So all done. Now the issue is we haven't really written anything to it, but we've created it. But since we've created it, what happens if we run this code again? So let's actually click the button again, and let's go through this and say, okay, it's going to do the same thing. It's going to try to create it. And what happens if we create it? Well, it's actually going to throw an error and say, you know what? It actually erred. It's going to say, and throw up an error saying, hey, unknown result. The drive actually already exists because we created it in our last run through this. So what do we need to do? So right now, when working with the API, there's no real way to say, does this exist? There's no create if exists method. So right now we actually have to catch this error and say, does it already exist? So we could add a little additional code down here to say if it exists, maybe we want to delete the drive and recreate it type of thing. So we could do something like this if we want to. We could say, let's put another try down here and say, well, do we really want to delete it? Let's just delete it. There's probably a better way to do this, but for the purpose of this example, we're just going to make it fairly easy. So let's put another catch down here, another cloud drive exception. Call it 1. We're just going to delete it here, and we're just going to write another console message. And this is just to illustrate what happened, the way you can say, hey, does it exist or not, and what happens if it exists, can I delete it? So we're going to do that. So let's run this again. So basically what we're doing is, so one example, we're going to change this to number 1. So we want to catch that exception right there. So let's run this. We're simply going to say if it already exists, let's just delete it and keep going. Another way maybe to do it is just say, hey, if it exists, use that one. But for this example and to illustrate how you can delete, we're going to run through it this way. So let's run this again. Let's click the button when it runs, and we're going to step through this, and it's going to say, hey, we're create, but it's already been created. So let's just delete it and keep going, right? Now we can't mount it because it's deleted, but let's throw some additional code in here and keep moving on with this example. So what we want to do with this example, and if we were to run this again, the create would actually work, which is fine because that's what we want. But let's add a little more code to actually add files to this drive. So right before or right after the mount, we're going to add the following. So for int I equals 0, we're going to add 100 files to this drive. And the way we're going to do that is we're just going to say file.write all text. Now basically we're going to write, what this is going to do is create 100 files just called 1.txt, do.txt, 3.txt, and just add some simple text to it, to each file that we upload. So here we're going to say, so add it to the drive letter. Oop, this is actually DL. Plus and then let's append the actual file name. The file name is going to be 1, 2, whatever. So i.toString plus, and it's going to be 1.txt. So we're going to say .text, and this is a test. Perfect. So as this loops, it's going to create 100 files. Now, before we run this, what we want to do is say, okay, well, yeah, it may add 100 files, but how do I know that they're there, and how do I possibly look at those files or know that they're there? So let's go back to our UI, I'm going to add a tab here. And let's drop another button on here. And in the click event of this, what we're going to do is we're going to actually loop through and get those files. And let's do something else. Let's actually drop a text box on here. Or sorry, a list box. Just make that a little bigger. Great. So list box 1. So let's go back here. And what we're going to do is once we click our first button that creates the drive and creates the files and adds those to our drive, we can then go and click the second button, which will loop through and read those files and add those to the list box. So we're going to do the same thing. So to save us a little typing, we're going to go up here and copy this. Actually, we're going to get that. So we're going to cloud drive, and we're going to create our cloud blob client. And what we're going to do is we're actually going to get a reference to the container that already exists. So get container reference drives. And then we're going to actually get a reference to the actual drive. So let's save us some typing. Then, like everything else, we need to mount that. So we're going to say string drive letter equals cd.mount. So kind of the same thing, 25 drive options dot force. The previous code mounts it, so we still need to mount it to get access to it. Now we can start looping using the standard system.io classes to loop through the files, because again, it's a drive, it's a directory. We can start looping through and listing all the files on that drive. So we're going to say directory info, new directory info, specify the drive letter and the path. Simple as that. Because we put them in the root of B, remember up here. So now we can say file info, and these are files. We're going to put those into array. Call those files equals get files. So simple system.io classes and allow us to query and loop through these files, and we're looking for everything that's ends with the .txt extension. There we go. And we can say for each file info in files. Now let's just loop through, and let's write the name of each file to the list box. So you can say list box 1 items.add name.toString. String. All right. So in this, same thing. We're getting a reference to our storage account, initializing the cache, an instance of the cloud blob client, getting a reference to the container, and then the drive, so the container drive, then the associated reference, which is the MyAwesome drive, mounting that, and then now that it's mounted, we can actually access that drive, and using the standard .NET system.io classes, we can loop through the files in that specific directory and list those. So let's save that. Let's compile to make sure everything's good. So what we're going to do with the first one, we're going to take this off because it's going to simply create the drive because we've deleted it before. So it's going to go through here and create the drive, mount it, and create 100 files for us, and then unmount it. And then we can click the second button, which will list the files on the drive. So let's run this. So we'll click that button. It's done. It ran, so we should have 100 files up in our drive. So if we click this button, there we go. It just ran that, and there's all 100 of our files up in the cloud. Now, in this example, what we did is go back to our code. In this example, what we did is we created a cloud drive by simply creating an instance of a cloud drive by taking a blob, formatting that as an NTFS drive, and then mounting that, writing files to that, and then looping through using the standard system.io classes and reading the names of those files on that drive and write them to the list box. So what we could actually do is say, you know, if I click on one of these, I could actually open it up because it's a standard text file, right? So your homework assignment is, if you've walked through this, now add the code to double click on that and open that up in a text file.